the good, the bad, and the ugly. I have a lot to say about the ugly, but some of the things we want to talk about so that this is productive is, what to look for when you're interviewing for a good manager, and how do you set expectations with your supervisor, and what to do when you're having issues with your manager. So I'll just start with some of my experiences and what my challenges were. In my first job after college, that was at the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab. And it was a really complicated workplace because it was associated with Princeton University, but it was run and operated by the Department of Energy. And so there was a lot of directions coming from different places. And it's an organization of about 500 employees and about 4 tiers to the organizational structure. So like my supervisor reported 4 levels up. And so one of the challenges was there were a lot of different departments. Everyone was supposed to be working towards the same goal, which was producing a fusion machine that could power clean energy. My department was the facilities department, and we were supposed to be responsible for making sure all the buildings were in good shape for people to be doing this work. And to give you an idea, we had about a 500-acre campus and 50 buildings to look after. And some of those were just housing physicists and engineers who were working on the project, support staff, but we also were in charge of the buildings that the experiments were in, which were very highly regulated spaces because it could be dangerous. And so one of our difficulties was organization, which of course as a librarian I was very concerned about. And one thing we didn't have a lot of good information on was all of our equipment across those buildings. We had thousands of pieces of equipment, but not really a great way to know what we had. So one of the first big arguments I got into with my supervisor was we wanted to do an audit of all our equipment. And we had a list from an old database that some of the information was good, some of the information was bad. And I was able to generate lists for each of our trade sections. We had carpenters, electricians, HVAC techs, and generate a list of what we thought we had for each department. My supervisor, his style was very much paying attention to what's on fire at the moment, and he didn't have a lot of long-term strategy, which was in contrast to myself. I was thinking about the long-term a lot, and so when it came to prioritizing, we sometimes clashed. And in this case, he wanted to give the entire list of all the equipment to all the tradespeople so that they could zoom, 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 get it as fast as possible. And I tried to explain to him, like, we need to have a master, and people can only have subsets of the master so that we know what's been completed. If you have people turning in audit pages and they might be overlapping, or maybe we don't have a way of ensuring that everything got done. And he said, no, we have to get this done immediately. And I said, I'm taking a firm stand on this. I will not distribute more than one copy of each list. And he took it without me and made the copies. And so one of the outcomes of this is they are still doing equipment audits. And I left there 3 years ago. And this was, I guess, 5.5 years ago that we were having this conversation, that he wanted to get everything done immediately. But that particular audit yielded really incomplete and messy results because I didn't have the freedom as the project manager to go about setting the structure for the project. And that was really challenging. So some things that I learned from this experience was that you can rely also on your peers if your manager is doing something you don't like. So I was able to at least talk to all the heads of the trades groups, which I had a good relationship with, and also try to communicate the vision and the mission of the project to them so that they could complete the audit to the best of their ability, even if they weren't getting the kind of clear, organized subsections that I wanted them to have. So another one of the questions we wanted to address is, what do you do when your manager's manager is bad? And so that can be really challenging, because I had a difficult work experience in my last job where my manager was very competitive with her subordinates. So she actually didn't like if you came to her with a good idea because she wanted to have all the good ideas. And, you know, when I would talk to people about this struggle, they would say, oh, well, why don't you talk to her manager? Her manager had actually previously held her position, and everybody said he was actually worse than she was. So that didn't seem like a good idea. And then once I passed him, it was already going to the university librarian. So that really wasn't an option. But what I was able to do is to take advantage of a lot of the training courses that they offered about communication and workplace conflict, so that even though I was kind of stuck in a situation where there weren't a lot of resources, that I knew that I could do my best with communicating and resolving conflicts. And a lot of the advice that you get in those kind of classes centers around the question of why. Why do you have this opinion? Like, if you're telling someone, you know, just do this, or I just want to do it this way, you're not really sharing your perspective with the other person in the exchange. So you always want to talk about your motivation. You know, I want to do X because, and that because part is really important, because everybody wants to process their own rationale. And if you haven't shared your rationale with them, they might not understand where you're coming from. One of the projects I was successfully able to do under this director, I was paying attention to the things that she cared about. And one thing she really cared about was our subscriptions. And so finally, when I floated a project about our subscriptions and making them more accessible, she was on board for that, because it was something that already mattered to her, as opposed to some of the other projects I'd been floating, which were kind of outside her realm of interest. So we also wanted to address managing up. And this was kind of interesting that it came up. I took a lot of management courses at Princeton University. Actually, they have a certificate program. And a lot of the classes were about managing downwards. And inevitably, it would come up, but how do I manage my manager? And so it seems like it's a very prevalent problem for a lot of people, that if you're just, you know, even if you have a good team, but you have a bad manager, it can be hard for that team to put together good work if they're kind of being held back by the person who controls their work culture. And so a lot of the strategies for managing downwards, if you're supervising employees, also apply to communicating with your manager if you feel like you need to manage up, which a lot of those techniques involve being very transparent. And again, going back to your rationale, you want to do something because, and also putting yourself in that person's shoes. So you might do that if you have an employee who's struggling, like think about their circumstances and try to identify what are the points they could improve and what things are holding them back. In the same way, when you're trying to manage your manager, you can put yourself in their shoes and think about, why are they having trouble with accepting the work we want to do? Or in some cases, it might be with respecting employees, and try to understand where they're coming from. And then when you're communicating back with them, you're kind of keeping those things in mind, so that you're not just talking past them, that you're actually saying things that are relevant, that will connect with them, so that you can share a vision, so that everybody's working towards the same goal. At this point, I'd like to stop for questions. Does anybody have any questions about anything I've said so far? All right, then we'll keep going. So another kind of scenario where you might have trouble with your manager is where there's no trust. The manager doesn't trust their team and the team doesn't trust the manager. And that's kind of the most difficult of the situations, because in the past examples I mentioned that there are communication strategies you can try. If there is no trust, it's really hard to get on the same page because the manager is always suspicious of the employees. It's very hard to change that mindset. So there's kind of an evaluation you can do for your workplaces. Do you get along with your manager? Do you get along with your peers? And at least one of those has to work, because if you are suffering from a bad manager, you can at least create coping structures within your peer group that you can rely on each other and support each other. And if you have a great manager, but there's maybe some tensions within your peer group, you can go to your manager for support. But when both those groups are not working for you, it's maybe time to consider moving on to another environment, because there's very little coping strategies available in that kind of environment. At this point, I'd like to open up for comments from our participants. If anyone has similar stories of things they struggled with in their companies and how they dealt with them.
Terrific. Thanks, Dana. Just to remind everybody that I am trying to take you off mute, but you are keeping yourself on mute. And if you hold down your space bar, it's almost like you're holding down your mic. So if you want to just be on temporary unmute, hold your space bar down while you speak, and that would be terrific. I'll start off with a question. Dana, I'm delighted to hear you talking about the various courses and resources that you've used in terms of dealing with people that, we call them challenging people. Really, they're people that think differently and behave differently than we do. And we take that as a challenge, right? That's
right.
Usual. And one of the things I wondered about was at the first instance that you were describing, where you and your manager were definitely on different planes about what was to happen there. Were you ever able to understand what was actually pressuring your manager in that direction?
Right. Well, as I said, my manager had a lot of other managers to report to. There were 4 other levels of management that were inspecting his work. And so anytime something became urgent to them, he dropped everything he was doing to take care of that item, because that was, everyone gets a performance review. And, so some people at the end of the day, they're just worried about what's going into my performance review. And if I don't meet this goal on time, how's that going to reflect on me? And my recommendation for people who are in management positions who have that struggle is to not be afraid to push back a bit. If your supervisor asks you for something in an unmanageable time frame, try making the argument that I definitely want to get you what you want, and here's what I need to do it well. And again, when people are looking at things differently, a top manager who's 4 levels above my manager has no experience in facilities, for example, doesn't know how long it takes to audit thousands of pieces of equipment. So kind of sharing the different perspectives and saying, this is what it looks like from my end, so that the managers and the managers and the managers, they understand what the challenges are. And hopefully they would prefer the quality outcome as opposed to the rushed outcome. And you can work with them to kind of set different expectations. And what is the expectation for this project?
Right. Or to find out that, in fact, they don't care about the quality, they care about the quantity. I mean, you
right.
don't know till you have those conversations.
Yeah. And one thing that was particularly challenging for me in that role was, as I mentioned, this was my first job out of college. So I didn't have a lot of work experience to point back to. But if I were in this situation again, I can use that story as an example to my manager of why I think doing it the quality way is so important. And I think it's really startling to hear that 5 years later, they still don't have all the information that they were hoping to gather in 2 to 3 weeks.
Right.
So it kind of helps people appreciate the scale more when they have the actual data from a real project that didn't go so well.
Exactly. Exactly. So when have our attendees, Lisa, Jill, Helen, Deb, Dawn, Sherry, Jane, Ray, I know you've all experienced this type of thing. How have you dealt with it? Sherry, how have you dealt with it? Sherry's going to ignore me. All right, Deb Hunt, how have you dealt with it?
Let's see, can I speak?
You can. Perfect.
Okay, hi. So I think that was really great advice about letting them know what it takes, because oftentimes you want to give pushback, but you don't want to seem too surly when you do it. So that's the hard part, is striking a balance between those two. I'm dealing with somebody right now who's actually at my same level, who is so closely holding information. That's the hardest part. It's like trying to drag information out of her, and she does that to everybody, and it makes it's just like, it's a bandwidth waste, because we're continually asking for stuff, and it's been really hard. And I've tried to we have a mutual boss, her to see that, and she's seeing it, excuse me, but not, I guess because this person does not do that to the boss. She only does it to all her peers. That it's hard sometimes to show that. So I've told other people to let our administrator know, so that she's not just hearing it from me, because it's just a waste of bandwidth. Just tell me the information so I can get on with my job.
Exactly.
And I think that's a power thing too, often for people who are insecure in their jobs, will often do that, and that is really difficult to turn around.
Yeah. And it's going to be interesting now to see how the pressures on people really start to play out.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Your webinar couldn't be at a better time, Dana.
Yes, that's so true.
Well, it's definitely extra challenging for people who are working from home, because if you're communicating by email, a lot of tone, body language, all the things we use to communicate get lost over email. So it can be really worth the extra step to make a phone call, or to do like a Zoom face-to-face if you have something difficult to say to your manager or another peer, to talk it out. If you do it over email, it heightens the possibility of going wrong.
Don't do it.
Right.
I would say don't do it. Yeah, at least use phone.
Right. Yeah, I had a similar experience to Deb's, where there was one peer in our group who wanted to hold on to information because she was insecure, and she was using that as a power technique, that she had things that she could withhold if she were ever in danger of getting removed from the team. And again, the way you put a spin on some things can really change it. There was one project that she'd done that came out very inaccurately, and previously people had tried to fix it, and she was very territorial, and she was like, you can't work on this. This is my turf. And so the project had been done, and for a year it was sitting around inaccurate, kind of unusable because it was so inaccurate. And when I posed it to her as a collaboration, as rather than I'm going to take your work and redo it, she was much more open to collaboration than taking over. And when I would talk to her about it, she would kind of identify the parts that she really felt needed to be done by her. But she was okay with me giving her material. And so then I had the ability to check the accuracy of the material before she worked on it. And then we were finally able to get it done in a way that was useful for everybody.
That's great. Great. Other comments, experiences? Lisa? Helen?
This is interesting. I wonder if this is kind of the nature of webinars, is that it's maybe a little scarier to speak, because when I would be in these management courses, everybody would be bubbling with
Of course.
things they had been through.
Of course. I don't know, this group is very quiet today.
Okay, I'll speak.
Oh, Penny, thank you.
Okay, so I'm sorry, as I've just texted everybody, I was a bit late, so I missed what Dana said, but it kind of basically comes down to trust, doesn't it? That, I mean, as a manager, I think the most struggle I have is when, for some reason, yeah, people don't trust me with the information for a variety of reasons. And it, you know, some of it's that insecurity, power. Some of them, they have deeply held cultural issues around privacy, and then that can make things difficult. And as a manager, if you don't have a good two-way dialogue, then it's hard. That sounds very sad, doesn't it?
Right. And I agree with that, Penny and Dana and everyone. And it's so essential that you form a relationship with a manager at the beginning, even if it's a new manager coming in, you know, to have a coffee or a lunch. Don't wait for them to ask you. So that, because the better you understand what, you know, they're coming from, what their goals and objectives are, which, you know, if you can do in an informal setting is fantastic. If not, then to even do that in a formal setting where you are finding out from them what their perspectives are and what their hopes are, what they know about the group, you know, because then when you do get into crunch situations, you have some understanding, you have some context, and it's much easier to approach them. And I just find a lot of people expect their managers to ask them for lunch or for coffee or, you know, for that first meeting. And you can't do that. We're all adults here, and they may not have thought of it either, or their calendar may simply be too full.
That's a great point. And, you know, we had a similar issue at my last workplace where we got a new employee, and the manager of that group invited all the professional librarians out to a lunch, but not any of the library technical assistants who were in that group. And right, I mean, that sends a strong message, which you can understand maybe how, oh, Rebecca, you look so horrified.
Yes.
And, you know, I was kind of trying to give them some advice, and then I thought, well, you know, if you go to the manager and complain, why wasn't I invited to lunch? That's not going to get you very far. I said, you know, you can try setting up your own lunch invitation to get this relationship rolling. And they were afraid to do that. And in my own experience, you know, I found that most of my advances in my professional career have been through people I know. And so building relationships is really important to me. So I started just asking everybody to lunch. And bless you, Rebecca. In my 2.5 years at Yale, I think I asked over 50 people to lunch. And none of them ever asked me to lunch back, but they always accepted. And so, and even one person would always say, oh yeah, let's do this again, but she never initiated. And so if you're waiting for the invitation, it may never come, but you have a lot of agency to create your own invitations going outward. And it can be scary. The first person I reached out to, I actually didn't know her through Yale, but she also worked at Yale Library. And I found her on LinkedIn, and I just shot her a message, kind of a shot in the dark, saying, I just started here. I find your work very interesting. Can we get a coffee sometime? And also, coffee is a good way to start if you're afraid, because coffee can be very short. And if it goes well, then maybe you can build yourself up to lunch. One person I asked was a department head here, and I thought, there's no way she has time for me. I am nobody. And I thought, well, the worst thing she could say is no. So I asked her to lunch. And she said, you know what, I'm really busy right now. And I thought, okay. 3 months went by, and then she emailed me to say, I've remembered that you asked me to lunch and things have calmed down and now I'm ready. And I was so surprised. I thought for sure I was never going to hear from her again. And not only did we go out to lunch, but she turned out to be a really great mentor for me. And we had many lunches after that. And it made me lose my fear of trying to reach out to people who were much higher than me in the hierarchy, because there were a lot of people there who were interested in mentoring young professionals, even though unfortunately in my specific department they were not. But I was able to supplement with people from other parts of the organization by reaching out to them.
Great. Great. Did you have more content you wanted to cover, Dana?
Sure. So something that I've talked about a lot is the importance of communication and how easily it can go wrong. And one thing to do if you're not sure that your communications have been getting through is to analyze your own communication style. So this is again from the training courses that I went through, that styles can range from avoiding, compromising, aggressive, and I'm blanking on the last one. Assertive. So assertive is the kind of goal. Assertive is when you're standing up for yourself. You are not afraid to put your own opinions forward, but you're also respectful and not overbearing. Whereas, assertive comes off often as, aggressive comes off as intense, in some cases mean, bullying. And so you're always going to put people on their defenses if you come off aggressive. And, some examples, if, one of your colleagues does something that you didn't like, an aggressive response would be like, why did you do that? And, you immediately put your colleague in the defense position. They might be like, it's none of your business. If you open that way. Avoiding might be your colleague does something that's really set you back and you just don't say anything because you're so scared to talk to them. And that's really not a healthy place to be, because, you're going to build up resentments and people aren't going to change their behavior because they'll never know that their behavior was a problem in the first place. Compromising is equally kind of as bad as avoiding. You may have the conversation, but your colleague says, this is how I want to do it. And you might say, okay, just because you want to keep the peace. And there's definitely a balance between peacekeeping and assertiveness, because sometimes you're not going to be able to be assertive without ruffling some feathers. And so the question is the peace of the office really worth it if you're getting steamrolled over and over and over again? And kind of recognizing that your opinion is just as worthwhile as anybody else's. Even your manager, you might think, oh, they have more work experience than me, or they have this fancy title, or they have a degree I don't. And a lot of people, that compromising or avoiding attitude comes from your own self-belief that you're maybe not as worthy or valuable as the people around you. So the first step, if that's what you're struggling with, is to look inward. Maybe write a list of your good qualities, of projects that you've worked on that went well, and then really say to yourself, my contributions matter, and start from that place of confidence. If you're trying to have a conversation with somebody that you're a little scared of them, also writing out what you want to say in advance can be really helpful, because once you're on the spot, it's really easy to freeze up. And if you have something written down in front of you, especially bullet points with the key points that it's easy to read, you can kind of help yourself stay on target in the moment when it's much more scary than when you're just planning it out. And so the assertive mode of communication often involves, like we talked about before, thinking about your own needs, but also thinking about the other people's needs. So, and that can make the difference between aggressive and assertive, because when you're being aggressive, you're only concerned about your own way of thinking and your own goals for completing the project. Whereas assertive is just, you state clearly and truthfully what your perspective on the situation is. And you always want to start with yourself. You never want, oh, I was muted and unmuted. Okay. Assertiveness. I just lost my train of thought. Okay, you want to start with yourself, right? Because the minute you start a sentence with you, that person is on their guard. Even if you're not being that harsh on them, you did this wrong, even if it's a minor thing, puts that person in their defensive mode. And then you've kind of lost the opportunity to have a balanced conversation. So even some like sentence modifiers that seem kind of silly or not that impactful can change it. You might say, I noticed you did blank. And then you can say, why did you do that? And asking why instead of moving forward with all your thoughts on why this was wrong is really important, because you don't know what their perspective is. You may think you know, you may assume, but you always want to give the person the opportunity to share their side, and especially before they've been put on the defense. So if you just ask a simple why question, why did you do it this way? They should hopefully feel comfortable sharing that with you. And then once you know for a fact what was going on the other end, you can have a more nuanced approach given what the context is.
Hey, Dana.
Yep.
Hear me? Hi, this is Jill Strand.
Jill.
I really appreciate those thoughts, and you just reminded me of something that somebody once shared with me. When you're having a conversation, whether it's a difficult one or something you have a question about, you're trying to understand where another person's coming from. They kind of framed it. It sounds a little silly, but she called it how to talk like a Buddha. And she said, you approach it by saying, you're seeking, like you said, you're seeking to understand, you're asking why, which is less likely to put them on a defensive position. And the framework is something along the lines of, when you did this, it made me think or feel, depending on what's appropriate for the situation, this. Can you help me to understand why you approached it that way? Could we consider doing X, and maybe have a suggestion, just to get the conversation rolling? And it sounds really simple, and it's harder to do in practice, and you kind of have to think about it a little bit. But I like it, and I've used it with my staff. I've used it with just like my husband when we're both like, and it does help. And I think it helps not only the conversation but it helps you kind of think about what you really want, because we're often in situations, at work or wherever, where you're just kind of frustrated. Like Rebecca was saying earlier, everybody's operates and thinks a little differently. So a lot of times you're like, why is this person, like Deb was saying, withholding information? Why are they doing this? It's such a time suck. And so that's what you're kind of trying to understand. And they may not be fully transparent with you. Maybe they don't feel like they want to admit that they are scared about their job or holding on to something because they're insecure. But at least, again, like you were saying earlier, by approaching it with a partnering aspect, it can help remove some of those defenses potentially.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah, sure.
You stated that so well too, Jill. I put in the chat to you. And the importance of that, what Jill just described is the classic feedback loop, right? When you said X, this is how I felt. I'd like to hear it from your perspective. Help me understand. And that is so important right now when we are really very conscious in workplaces about this may not have been your intent. This was the impact, right? You may have felt that by, calling something a virus, that your intent is not to cause racism, and that is the impact that it is having for some people. I mean, that's a pretty extreme example I've just put out there. It's very real in our workplaces right now. even when people are trying to be jocular, like I just was. Probably my impact was not what I wanted it to be. So your examples and Jill's reiteration there was really helpful.
I did like, sorry, it's Penny.
Hi, Penny.
Hi, I like what Dana said though in terms of the slight twist there, that you do open it with the I bit. So I felt about what you did. So the first part is on you, on you rather than them, because I think that is, as you said, it creates a more balanced approach, which is more, it just gives you that starting point. Removing the kind of attack feeling that a you statement might come with, particularly if it is something really quite difficult. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Penny. Yeah, and I think some of the challenges of these I and you statements is I might start with the I part, and then when I get to the you, I'm still tempted to go, you did something wrong. Like one example was one of my colleagues who was responsible for our scan and deliver service didn't tell me something pretty important about an update to the scanner. And I was like, I was disappointed when you didn't tell me the update. And so when you kind of have a struggle making a statement that's really neutral and fair, I like to default to questions. And so the next time we talked about it, I said, oh, I didn't know about this update. And he said, oh, I thought you knew. And then I said, well, who should be responsible in the future for making sure I get the update since it fell through the cracks this time? And kind of the only answer to that, since it was his responsibility, was me, me being him. Sorry, pronouns are getting a little confusing here, but, kind of asking a question that kind of forces him to confront the aspect of the situation that I'm most concerned about without using the word you at all.
Do you think one of the things I think, and maybe you covered this in the part I missed, but I think for us all, one of the things that's getting more challenging is the flatter structures that there are in organizations. So in olden days, things were maybe a bit more hierarchical, so it was clearer. People knew what their relationship was to their manager, and then their manager knew what their relationship was to their manager. But now, and some of the examples you've talked about have been maybe more peer-to-peer. There's a lot more, it's equality. Managers are here to serve you. Your manager's there to support you. It's kind of a flatter structure, and then that gets confusing. So it can be that people do things that upset other people because they genuinely, as you say, in a way, you have to ask that why did you do that? But it may be that there isn't a clear answer, and their thinking about it is equally valid as yours. I mean, it depends obviously a bit what it is. If something's very operational, then it might be clear cut, but other situations where people can get upset, or it can just be a perception as to how this flatter structure is working for people, and the whole much more virtual teams, and well, literally these days, but about 2 weeks ago, virtual teams might not have necessarily meant you were all virtual, but that you came together in a kind of ad hoc way, and there's a lot more of that, a lot more fluidity, I think, now than there used to be.
That's really helpful, and especially since my experience, even though, as you said, is the big hierarchical kind of structures are starting to give way to flatter structures. Since I've worked for big universities, their strict hierarchy is still in place. So I'd love to hear about what your experience has been working in a flatter work environment.
Certainly. I was just going to say, from my perspective, I've definitely seen a change, and so now I, as a manager, have to have a much more the servant leader, or whatever they call it now, servant leadership. So then you just can't dictate to your staff what to do. It's much more a give and take, and bringing them with you on the journey, and you know, and you know, tapping into their expertise a lot. But if they don't volunteer that, or don't have it, then obviously there's other issues. But it's definitely, I think, an interesting dynamic. But I'd be really keen to hear from other people on the group if they've experienced this, you know, similar, or have other examples.
Mm-hmm. Anybody?
Hey,
this is, oh, go ahead, Deb.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think part of that is mentoring and modeling the behavior. And that's exactly what you guys were talking about earlier. You know, I was just thinking about the Dana's for, you know, the avoidance, the compromising, the aggressive or assertive. I am taking notes because this is good stuff. And I think modeling that behavior, and sometimes that's hard to do, especially so I know there's probably millennials on the call, and I'm the mom of millennials, but I've noticed a difference in sometimes the mode of communication, and trying to think, you know, I was talking about the type of communication in the sense of the method of not, I'm not saying this right, the strategy versus the type of communication. And Rebecca, you alluded to that earlier, that you got to pick up the phone sometimes. Don't assume that a text or an email is going to show those nuances, even if you put a smiley in there or whatever it is. And I think so many people, and especially now when we're all working remotely, right? I mean, I've worked remotely full time. I know, Rebecca, you do a lot of that because you work at home a lot, and I used to do that full time too. But I'm seeing now that I've got this whole team that is working remotely because, you know, San Francisco's been on lockdown since Monday at midnight, and trying to figure out, everybody's got different technology. So some people are having a harder time. Some are less experienced at, you know, even using things like Zoom or GoToMeeting, and trying to figure out ways to communicate that are inclusive, but also hold people accountable to communicate in a way that is understandable and courteous to others while getting their point across. That's a long ways around it. But I guess what I'm saying is there's a technology component that a lot of times some people tend to rely on more than they should. And that's important to think about, meeting people where they are, but also bringing them up to where they need to be. And I think this virtual teams that we have going on right now is forcing that issue, but in a good way.
Yeah, for sure. Jill, what were you going to say?
Oh, wow, now I have to remember. Well, it's kind of along the same lines, and I recently had even before we started working remotely, I was having an interaction with somebody who was a couple people who were working from home, and there was just a question that I needed to understand, and you know, we were doing IM chat and email back and forth, and it was, you know, I was trying to make an effort to like just have a quick call or a quick chat because I knew we could quickly resolve it. And so one of my coworkers in another department, and I think it was a very weird situation where I think they were doing some testing with one of our users of one of our research analytics databases, and I heard about it on the fly, and I said, hey, I'd like to learn more about what you're trying to do. Just, you know, from what little I hear, there could be a problem. You know, there could potentially be a violation of our license agreement. And I think they hadn't thought through. They know that we have these agreements and they know to work with us. We've partnered on a lot of projects before, but I think in their minds, they weren't at the place where they needed to kind of, you know, walk it by us first. I think they were still in very early stages, not aware that they might already be towing up against the line. So when I reached out, I think, and maybe I shouldn't have, you know, shared that part about violating our agreement right off the bat in reflection, but I wanted to kind of understand the problem. So I think it put them a little on the defensive. So there was a lot of email back and forth, which was very frustrating for all of us. And finally, the one coworker's manager and I were able to get on the phone and kind of sort it out in like less than 5 minutes, and then talk about some ways we could communicate more directly and regularly going forward to make sure we didn't run up into this again. So I think that, and I was to Dana's point earlier, I was trying to be assertive about, like, look, I'm not just going to go away. You guys need to work with us. And we can do that. We're happy to do that. We have we got some game here that could be helpful to you in this project, but you have to loop us in. But yet I was trying to do it in a very, assertive but not pushy way, which I think helped. But so I think that it's, in a way, although working remotely and having those communications issues is a challenge, I'm hopeful that the upside of this whole situation we find ourselves in is that we'll continue to reach out directly and recognize when the technical digital communication isn't working and make those connections, whether it's on a phone or a Zoom meeting. I'm really loving seeing how businesses that I have worked with in the past are sending out emails about what they're doing to prepare for this. And one business in particular sent a picture of all their staff on Zoom. And they were all kind of like waving and saying hi. And I thought, that's kind of cool. Like, just they're showing that they're still finding ways to connect and they can see each other and hear each other and get over those communication humps. And I think that while chat is great, email is great, cell phones, text is great, sometimes just being able to hear a voice, hear inflection, and make those connections is what you really need to do.
Yeah.
To get things done.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jill. What a great example of both trying to keep the conversation positive and also the power of a phone call over email, which is so prevalent these days.
Right. But I was going to say, too, which builds on what Deb and Jill were saying, and of course on what you're saying, is this is about communication. And we've been talking about the use of I before you. And where we really need to be focusing now is on we. So very often somebody doesn't recognize that the behaviors or actions that they've taken are a reflection on the organization, whether that's the unit or whether that's the whole library and public libraries or academic. And so in talking about how we need to be addressing this, and with working from anywhere, which is what virtual is, it's so important. I know everybody's sort of been thrown into this, and I encourage everybody to think about what Dana's saying and to quickly come back and say, these are our ground rules. These are our dynamics for how we're going to work together. This is when we're going to pick up the phone. We're going to have daily check-ins. We're going to do this, whatever it is. And to set those parameters early on, even if you need to come back in, again, thinking about what Dana's been sharing with us, and build them in again, how important that is. And in a way, when we work virtually, it makes everything that we do when we're working physically together visible. You have to keep things visible. I have managed groups across the country, and I've managed groups within a city. And as Deb says, I have worked from a virtual office for 30 years. And it is so important to keep everything visible in front of people and make it very clear what the expectations are and how we're going to communicate.
Absolutely. And to touch on what you said about having clear communication channels and keeping things visible, this was also one thing that I struggled with. My first job was we would have a once a month whole department meeting. And it became very clear that people weren't communicating individually because these meetings were so long and so boring because everyone would go around the room and you'd get to one manager and then they'd bring up something they're working on, and then all the people from that group would start kind of hashing things out right there in this meeting, which was just supposed to be an update and progress meeting. And so, if I'd been a manager in that situation, something really great to do would have been to set up more regular communication for each of the little groups so that the update meeting became really an update meeting. And it was inhibiting progress because people knew that they could communicate during this big meeting, I that may have encouraged them to even not talk to each other, because they're like, oh, we'll just handle it during the meeting. And it became a huge waste of everybody's time. And again, another thing in that situation was one of the groups was supposed to publish a document every day of what they were working on. And the manager would always say, you have to update it every day. It has to be updated. And what the group started doing is it was supposed to be ready for the morning, so that people knew where they were going to be all day. And they ended up updating it every day as per the requirement, but at the end of the day, after the work had already been done. And, so, looking at when communication like that is flagging that it's indicative of a deeper problem, this group was having difficulty planning out their work. And so, one way to help that is not just to set the requirement, you have to update this daily, but to, if they're missing tools or resources that could help them plan better, I forget who said it, like service management, that you connect them with the resources they need to be able to plan, such that they can publish their schedule every day in the morning, or even at the end of the day before, because they're able to plan and communicate, instead of just, trying to throw something up there to meet the requirement. It's meeting the law, but not the spirit.
Right. And as Deb just said, what Dana is describing is a control issue. If one cannot trust those that they work with, it drags everyone and the organization down. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And one of the things that was going on with this group is the manager wanted them to have a plan and not to deviate from the plan. And this was facilities work, so often last minute urgent things would pop up, so then they would go do that. And if they didn't address an urgent issue quickly enough, they would get reprimanded for not being quick enough. But then also, if they didn't get enough of their daily goals done, they'd be reprimanded, even though they had gotten pulled away to deal with the urgent issues. So it was a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. And that's part of also what contributed to them having difficulty putting a plan in, because they were afraid if they put too much on the plan, then they would be penalized for not getting to it. And if they put not enough on the plan, and then there weren't that many emergencies, then the manager would be like, well, what did you do all day? Right. So developing the trust, also, showing that you believe in their judgment. If they decided to drop something and go to something else, that, they were making a judgment call about priorities. And, in the case that you really don't trust their judgment, it's probably not a great situation, but at least if you're communicating and they have access to you when one of those judgment calls comes up, you can talk through it with them, so that they're making a decision that everybody agrees on, can really help get out of that no trust situation.
Exactly. Well, Dana, we only have 3 minutes left. Are there any parting words that you'd like to share with the group?
Parting words. Managers can be challenging. Definitely. One last thing I wanted to mention is the importance of scheduling time to talk. If you're having an issue with your manager and you just pop by their office or shoot them an email or call them without them knowing it's coming, they might not be in a good headspace to deal with that issue. So that one really great practice is to, whichever mode of communication you want, email or in person or phone, say, hey, I've got something, it'll take about 10 minutes, when's a good time for you? And then since they've already kind of agreed to have the time and the mental space to discuss it with you, that they can be fully present when you talk to them.
Absolutely.
And that really helps a conversation with the manager go better.
Well, it's respectful of everybody's time too, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I've tried to unmute everyone again. I just want to say thank you so much to Dana for really a very engaging, it's wonderful not to have PowerPoint. You were very engaging, very articulate. Your points are bang on and gave, what did you call us? Our coronials.
Yeah.
Coronials, I love that. Things to think about and to reflect on. And I want to thank everybody for being here. We do hope that you'll be more comfortable to speak up next time. Helen, Lisa, Tina, oh, there they go, they're leaving. This is and I will be posting it within today. I'll get it done tonight, post it up to the LMD website. Okay, and Dana, we are hoping you're going to follow through with your next in the series.
Absolutely. I'll see you all next time.
Okay, great. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks.